really nervous about this sermon, and that's weird because I don't get nervous about speaking in front of people. Why should I do? But like, not this nervous. So pray for me during this. So I really went super 80s with this because I thought it would be so funny to do like an 80s themed like sermon. And so I thought this would be really cool when Mitch starts his church, to do like an 80s themed thing and have like 80s memes all over the place. But this is, it's called Trim the Fat. I was thinking Jane on the videos, I was gonna put her up there, but then I was like, nah, because of what she wears. So, but it all came really from this story in the book of Mark, and it's in Mark 5. I'm going to be in Mark 5, and it's a crazy famous story about Jesus. And I'm just going to read a couple beginning verses, just so that way we can get ourselves re-familiar with it, because there's a lot of stuff we miss. And so when Jesus had again crossed over by boat, I'm in verse 21, when Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, and he pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her." How many of you are happy that we have a God that all he has to do is put his hands on the situation and it can be changed?
Yeah.
He says, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so she will be healed and live." And so I think what's so cool is that, first of all, Jesus has crossed the lake. And in the previous chapter, well, in the previous story, because this is all the same chapter, in the previous story, Jesus has just exorcised a demon like a bad A movie star. And now he has crossed over the lake, and all of these tons and crowds of people are coming to see him. And the interesting detail that it gives us is that Jairus comes to see him. And Jairus is a synagogue leader. And synagogue leaders are the equivalent to pastors today. And I think what's interesting, what we don't really appreciate, is that synagogues in the ancient world are not like churches in the South. There was not one on every corner. There was one. There was one synagogue for miles on end. So if your town had a synagogue or if your town had a church, you guys are doing really, really well, because people were coming and traveling on Saturday, not Sunday, Saturday to come in and hear the word of God. And so in retrospect, you could say Jairus was a mega pastor because he had a very, very large flock of people coming to hear him. Hoot and holler and not speak in tongues yet. That didn't happen yet. But just really preach about God. And what I think is so fascinating about the character of Jairus is because he's speaking life into all of these people, and people are coming to watch his faith on stage, and he's dying inside. And he's dying inside because his little girl is sick with, the Bible doesn't tell us what. It could be cancer, it could be pneumonia. Based on how clean they were back then, it could have been the common cold. We don't know. But his little girl is deathly ill, and she's sick, and she's dying. And I can only imagine, as a father, him having to go up there every single Saturday and speak and teach and do all this other stuff. And inside, he is very, very hurt by seeing his daughter in this condition. And I think a lot of times we read the story and we think that Jairus must have known who Jesus was. He must have been following Jesus if he were to come and ask. I mean, after all, it says in verse 23, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so she will be healed and live." So that speaks of somebody who probably knows who Jesus is or was following Jesus. But I personally, and this is just me, I can be controversial, I don't think Jairus knew Jesus. I don't think he even cared about Jesus, to be honest. I think that Jairus was so sick and tired of taking his daughter to doctor's appointments and sages and people praying over her and people saying it's going to be okay and people visiting her and bringing flowers, and there was one whiff in the air. There was one sound of something genuine, of something not religious, of something that was relational and real, and he went to go see what it was. He did not care about all of this other stuff Jesus did because he just wanted something well for his daughter. And I think that's so fascinating because there's so many times in our lives that God allows for us to get to our lowest just so that way we can be our vulnerable and our most real self and find him and ask him with what we're dealing because we know that he's the only real thing. And so what's so cool is that Mark is a very good author. Mark is an awesome author. And the reason why Mark is such an awesome author is because he inserts someone else's miracle into this miracle. And a lot of people know who that someone is. They know on the other end of society there's this woman, and she's been suffering for 12 years, hemorrhaging. Now, hemorrhaging has to do with an issue of blood. And because she's a woman and because of the times and the laws with how women were made unclean by bleeding, it was probably she was menstruating. And it just didn't stop. And she kept going to doctors to try to get it fixed. And nobody wanted to be near her because to touch somebody who had a disease or who was dealing with an illness or dealing with health problems was to be unclean ritually. And so she would have probably been an outcast. Not so much because she was a woman, but because she was sick and she was not well. And so what I think is so cool is that there's this passage in the story. Actually, let me find it real quick. There's this passage in the story where she says, it says, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. If I just touch Jesus' clothes, I will be healed. And this is actually evidence of a tradition that was going around. So Jesus was a rabbi, or a teacher, is what they would call, like pastors. So Jesus was like a pastor of sorts. That's another sermon. And rabbis would wear these shawls, these prayer shawls. And these shawls would have 613 tassels on the end of them. And so it was a custom for when rabbis would walk through the cities with their long robes. Jesus talks about how rabbis and teachers wear long robes and their shawls, that it was good luck or good fortune to tug on the tassels. And so this woman is saying, well, I'm not going to do this thing in a superstitious way. I'm not going to participate in this in a religious way. Mm-hmm. I'm coming to God with my faith, and I'm expressing to him the best way I know how, the best type of worship I can give through this act. And it's through this act that Jesus turns to her and welcomes her into the community and calls her daughter and says that she is made well. And we all know that story. But what really was troubling me was, you can write down my next point, not for everybody. Not for everybody. Is this verse that was just, I was wrestling with in this story. Because like, you hear that and you're like, that's awesome, Jesus, that's great. And then you read the next couple verses and it's like, what? And so I'm going to read, I'm going to read this part where Jairus' family comes out. And they basically come out and they say, your daughter is dead, they said, why bother the teacher anymore? And they're basically saying it's a lost cause. You might as well not even trouble Jesus, he's been taking too long. And so Jesus, says, just believe, but this is the verse that troubled me. It says, and he allowed no one to follow him. Is that the type of Jesus that you heard about in Sunday school? The Jesus who will go around and say, follow me, come unto me, and all will be rested, and lay your burdens on me. But it says, and he allowed no one to follow him. Why did Jesus not let anybody follow him? Because you would think that he would want people to see this miracle and to believe in him, but he doesn't want anybody to follow him. And the reason why is because the crowd that was needed for the outcast miracle was not needed for the mega preacher's miracle. And what I think is fascinating is that, this is going to sound left field, palm trees are interesting. Palm trees are interesting because of something called contrary conditions. So when you think of a hurricane, you probably think of that picture of palm trees blowing in the wind. And the reason why this is a very powerful image for me is because when the wind is blowing against the palm trees in a contrary way, they're digging their roots into the ground and they're becoming stronger. So we think of hurricanes as depravity and terrible for people, but it's great for the plants because they're getting stronger. And I learned this the hard way because we went to Wilmington Beach, I think around Easter. And so me being the Bible nerd that I am was like, hey, let me get a palm branch for Easter service. And so I told my mom and dad to pull over to the side of the road. And I climbed up on the car, and I was this idiot in this hotel parking lot on the freeway trying to cut off a palm branch. And let me tell you something. Palm Sunday must have had machetes because these things were not budging. They did not want to come off of this tree. And I'm sitting there hanging off, trying to get this palm branch off. And my dad's like, hurry up before the hotel staff sees you. He comes out and tells you to get off the tree. And so I think that's so interesting because it was because of the hurricane, it was because of the storm that this tree was made strong enough. And Jesus dismisses this crowd. Jesus dismisses this crowd because he's saying, Jairus, every single Saturday, you get up there, you hoot and holler, you do a sermon, you do a song and dance for everybody so their faith is renewed and they think that you're some holy person. But right now, I need you to be real. I need you to be vulnerable. And I need you to understand that I'm here to change the course of this whole story. The enemy wrote a script, and the ending to his script was so depressing that I wrote a new one. And I want you to engage in this as real as you possibly can. And so, the next point is, other than, was that it? Oh, cool. Jesus eliminates excess. This is why other people do slides for me. So, the second part of this verse is really interesting too, because it says, and he allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And so my question always was, Sunday school Julius's question was always, why only Peter, James, and John? Because if you read the Bible, or if you don't know that much about the Bible, Peter, James, and John are Jesus' inner circle. And so we don't usually think of Jesus as having favorites, but Jesus had favorites. And Peter, James, and John. He shared all of his stuff with them. And I was like, why Peter, James, and John? Like, why is that so significant? And I was reading this really weird website. It's really out there. But I thought that their explanation was the best. Because, quite frankly, all of the other ones were like, Peter had to preach on Pentecost, and da-da-da-da-da. I'm like, no. I need something deep, okay? So, if you isolate in the Gospels, every single time Peter, James, and John are singled out, you come up with 3 events. 1, Jesus rising the little girl from the dead. 2, the Transfiguration, which if you don't know what that is, that's Jesus going up to a mountain, revealing his glory. 2 dead prophets appear, Moses and Elijah, and he speaks to them about his death to come. And then the 3rd time is when he's praying in the garden, and he's sweating blood, and he's crying, and he doesn't want to go through the death that he's going to die. And then he comes back to these guys specifically, and he's mad at them because they're asleep. And then Judas comes and arrests him, and the soldiers kill him. And so the 3 isolated incidents are all about death. They're all about death. They're all about the death that is to come. But there's only one, Jairus' daughter being raised from the dead, that's not about Jesus' death. It has nothing to do with Jesus' death whatsoever. And so I was thinking, I was like, why? And this is the first one. This is the first time Jesus ever singles them out. And so I was thinking, I was like, why would Jesus, the second 2 times, be singling them out about his death, and this time only be singling them out about some little girl's death? And I remembered how sometimes God will show us glimpses of himself before we go through the storm. And so when Jesus is saying in this moment that, look guys, I have power over death. I have power over death. Right. So when we're on that mountain and I'm talking about my death with Moses and Elijah, then you know I'm going to do it again. I'm going to rise from the dead. Yeah. When you see me coming through the streets with my head covered in thorns and they start nailing me to a cross and I give my life for the world and there's that long Saturday of you being sad because I'm gone, don't you fret, because I can do it again. I have power over death, and this moment is preparing them for that Sunday that is going to come.
Come on.
And so we see that God can sometimes show us glimpses in other people or show us glimpses of his power before we even go through the storm.
Yeah.
And so Jesus eliminates excess. And then the final point I want to make is cut it out. Or as my Uncle Glenn would say, cool it. Cool it or cut it out. And so the next couple of verses of scripture, I think, are like the funniest and saddest verses, like in the Gospels. And you'll see why in a second. So they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, or the mega preacher, you can say, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And so that's understandable because the girl has just passed away. And so they're mourning her, and that's understandable. I mean, in the history of the world, no one has ever been risen from the dead, unless it was a prophet doing it. But then again, why would God care about some, like, little girl in the middle of nowhere's death? I mean, I'm not saying that, like, to be like, God doesn't care, but, like, I mean, why would her, of everybody else who was important, be raised from the dead? And so they're crying because of their limited understanding of what is going on. And so, what happens? Jesus said, and when he entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? This girl is not dead, but sleeping." I didn't rhyme that. That was the Bible. I was like, yo, Jesus, you rhyme bars. And what I think is interesting is that Jesus comes in to speak truth into the situation, and this is what they do to him. And they laughed at him. What? Weren't they just making a commotion and weeping and wailing loudly? And what do they do at him? They laughed at him. And I think what's so interesting is that sometimes the loudest influencers in our lifetime, in our lives, are there put by the enemy to sort of cushion the contrary conditioning that the Lord is trying to change us through. You know, this story is all about Jairus' faith. It's only about Jairus, even though there's a miracle in the middle of it. It's only about Jairus. And what I think is so fascinating is that his family is there. And they're trying to comfort him by mocking this person who's like, yeah, she's going to rise from the dead. But Jesus is coming in and speaking life. And what are they doing? They're coddling him spiritually. They're spiritually cushioning the blow that God wants him to go through. And I think a lot of times we surround ourselves with people who just say niceties or say things like, oh, it's going to be okay, or oh, it's going to be over by the end of the week, or oh, you don't need to fret. And it's like, no, God was trying to bring you through something. He's trying to bring you through a hurricane. And what you're doing is, instead of letting the palm tree become stronger in the hurricane, you're cutting it down and planting it somewhere else. And that's not going to make the tree stronger. That's not going to make you stronger, because you're allowing yourself to be shielded from what God is trying to bring you through to make you stronger.
Yeah. And
so it's not that Jairus' family is evil, because they're not. They're just ignorant. But we need to recognize that the devil thrives with ignorance. He loves it. There's so much of it in America right now. And so I think that when God speaks life into a dark situation, that darkness cannot stay. And so we see that in the next line, but he put them all outside and took the child's mother and father into where the girl was. But notice how it said, but he put them all outside. Their faith was so weak that it wasn't even a question as to if they could even stay or not. Jesus already got rid of the crowd, He already got rid of the majority of the disciples. So obviously, somebody who's just in the way of Jairus' faith is just going to be kicked out of this one. And I think that a lot of times we experience contrary conditions. And we need to start doing what Jesus did and start trimming the layers of fat, trimming the layers of insulation that are going to soften us from experiencing what God has for us. And I think a lot of times it's not that we should cut people out, because I would never say cut someone out. But I think for some seasons we just need to allow some people to just shut up. Like, Pastor Stephen has said that a bunch of times. Like, that's the most spiritual thing you could say sometimes. Shut up. Like, stop. Like, you don't need to be speaking, because God is doing something in me right now. Yeah. And all of that Hallmark crap is not helping me grow. And so, I'm going to pray, but if you're experiencing contrary conditions, just constantly be open to being vulnerable in what God is doing in your life. So Jesus, we thank you for this day. We thank you